Thank you, Rini. Now, this is a session we all have been really looking forward to, and personally, so have I. And so it is my proud privilege. Professor Roubini, I don't know if you can see me or hear me clearly. This is Arnav. It is my pleasure to welcome you today. All of India, through our network, the Republic Media Network, would want to hear your take on global events, how we will come out of the present situation where we are placed, and India's role in the global economy. So I'm looking forward to my fireside chat with you, Professor Roubini. But before I introduce you for your opening address, may I please introduce you formally to our audience watching this with me here in the hall, as well as across on television and streaming. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Roubini may be best known for predicting the subprime mortgage crisis in the United States and the subsequent global financial crisis of 2008. But he's a man who has studied and analyzed the Asian economy in equal depth and perspective. And he's also predicted the Asian financial crisis that destabilized the Asian economy at the end of the 1990s too. So he's a man of deep vision. His keynote address is on the theme of India's role in the global economy, after which I'd love to have a fireside chat with you as well. So over to you, Professor Roubini. Do go ahead. We're all ears. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor. I usually come and visit India at least once a year. This time is going to be virtual, but hopefully once COVID is gone, I'll be able to come and visit again. I'll speak mostly about the Indian economy and its recovery, but I would like to start by putting it in the global context of this COVID crisis. The COVID recession was the worst global recession since the Great Depression. And of course, there was a synchronized global recession last year that hit hard both advanced economies and emerging markets. We had to shut down economic activity to flatten the curve and reduce the spread of the contagion. And therefore, this was both an aggregate supply and an aggregate demand shock. This was the bad news, the worst recession in decades. The good news was that it was also the shortest global recession. It lasted mostly the first half of last year, because once we controlled the spread of the contagion, we started reopening gradually, and there was a massive amount of policy stimulus, monetary, fiscal, credit, to try to boost economic activity, both conventional and unconventional policy. Now, the recovery in different countries was, in some cases, a V-shaped recovery, rapid return to strong growth, in some cases more anemic, like a U, and in some cases a double-dip recession, because there were second or third waves of the contagion, like in the case of Europe and the Eurozone. So it was not a kind of a regular recovery. And unfortunately, for many poorer developing countries, this is not a pandemic recession. This is a pandemic depression, as the World Bank has estimated that up to 150 million people may fall back to the extreme poverty condition because of what has happened. Today, there is a recovery in the global economy, but there are some downside risks deriving from 5 factors. One, there may be new variants of the COVID that may be vaccine resistant. Secondly, winter is coming back in the Northern Hemisphere, and there is already rising cases, say, in Europe. And actually, some countries like Austria and others are imposing new lockdown. 3, there are supply bottlenecks in goods markets, labor markets, energy, commodity, transportation, logistics that are restraining the recovery. 4, there is now a rise in inflation, both in the US, advanced economies, and emerging markets, that may lead to earlier policy tightening and slow down economic growth. And now, finally, 5th factor, there is a slowdown of China given the amount of debt and leverage, especially in the property sector, but not only. And people are asking the question whether China is going to have a hard landing or a Lehman moment. Now, if I could speak about India, India, like the rest of the world, went into a recession last year, as there were two waves of the pandemic, the second one in the first half of this year. GDP fell by 7.3% in the last fiscal year, 2021, but now there is a recovery in the current fiscal year. However, this drop of 7.3% is very sharp, given that potential growth of India is above 7%. Let me ask, what were the policy responses of India to the COVID crisis? And I would argue that the policy responses of the policy authorities were overall appropriate and correct. And they took six aspects. First, the authorities dealt with the health crisis and implemented an aggressive vaccination drive once vaccine became available this year. 50% of the population has already gotten a first jab. Hopefully, 70% of the population will have a first jab by the first quarter of next year. Secondly, there was looser fiscal policy and policy stimulus, especially transfer payments to the vulnerable groups in the society, like the poor, the migrants, the rural population. That led to a larger budget deficit. Three, monetary policy became easier, both conventional, loosening and reducing policy rates, and unconventional, like quantitative easing. Four, the government provided liquidity provision to the private sector and banks to avoid a situation where illiquidity would lead to insolvency. Five, there was an accommodative financial sector and regulatory policy to try to avoid a credit crunch that would hurt economic growth. And finally, there was also six-factor continuation of economic structural reform. Let me talk now about some of the positives of the Indian economy. Then I'm going to talk about some of the downside risks, and then on the necessary policy actions. On the positive side, you have now high rates of vaccination and a very sharp fall in new cases that are now below 10,000 per day. There is also a strong economic recovery from the recession, and it's estimated that in the current fiscal year, economic growth could be as high as 9.5%. Some people say even 10%. Government revenues have been better than expected, and the Indian equity market has been among the best performing in the world, close to the performance of the United States, much better than other emerging markets. Moreover, FDI, foreign direct investment inflows into India are strong, especially in the tech sector. Moreover, banks are now flush with liquidity, and therefore there are easy liquidity conditions that will allow them, if they want to lend more. And moreover, the cleanup of banks, that bad assets, has continued, and that's a positive for a resumption of credit growth. Moreover, a number of economic reforms have continued, among them asset sales, privatization, monetization of public assets via PPPs, public-private partnership, and those are ongoing. Moreover, India is a vibrant democracy, is a free society, and is a market-oriented economy that helps over time knowledge and innovation that are key for long-term economic growth. India is also has a young population, and population growth can increase potential growth if people have education, skills, human capital, and healthcare. Moreover, India has a strong comparative advantage in the IT, informational technology sector, that has a comparative advantage globally. And moreover, because of the COVID situation, there is now a process of hyper-digitalization. The way we live, we work, we study, we socialize, we shop, we entertain, we interact with each other is becoming more digital. And that helps India, that has a comparative advantage in IT services. It will boost its exports of these services. Moreover, India has a potential growth already close to 7%, and with more economic structural reform, this potential growth could go as high as 9%, while the potential growth of China today is at best 5%, possibly lower over time, given their amount of debt and leverage. So these are the positives about India and the economy. Let us talk briefly about some of the potential risks and downsides for the Indian economy. First is that the informal economy is weak right now compared to the formal sector. The jobs and the incomes are fragile among the poor, the rural, the migrant population. Among these groups, there is slow income growth that is being eroded by inflation. So the real incomes is not growing very much. So there is a duality of income and consumption. The top 20% of the population is doing reasonably well, while the bottom 50% is still struggling income-wise and consumption-wise. And the demand for income support among the poor is still very high. Moreover, credit growth among the banks is still weak, as the banks are risk-averse and even more averse to lend to the weaker economic groups. The big firms in society, the largest firms, are doing well, revenue-wise and profit-wise, but small and medium-sized enterprises are struggling and losing market share. So in India today, we have more poverty and more inequality after this COVID recession. The share of profit is going up, while the share of labor income is going down. There has been an income redistribution from the bottom to the top income groups, and there has been a Darwinian success of larger firms relative to SMEs, of listed firms versus those that are unlisted, and of formal firms versus informal. Moreover, investment to GDP, capital spending, a decade ago used to be 39%. Today, the number is smaller. It's closer to 31% of GDP. And since capacity utilization rates are low in manufacturing, private investment is growing, but it's not going to grow very, very strongly. Moreover, GDP today in India is still 6% below the pre-COVID path, while in a typical emerging market is only 3% below the pre-COVID path. The country also has large fiscal deficits that require medium-term fiscal consolidation. The deficit between central and local government is well above 10% of GDP. We also have a problem of inflation right now, above 5%, that is fed by higher energy prices, commodity and food prices. The target of the RBI is between 2 to 6%. You also have coal shortages that may weaken production recovery. There has been a forced diversion of coal from steel firms to electric utilities, and there are also chip semiconductor shortages that have slowed down car manufacturing. Moreover, the country's high energy prices are problematic because India is a net energy importer. It's good that the IT sector is a strong part of the economy, but IT sector is only 1% of employment. So India needs to generate jobs in many other sectors, including manufacturing and other services. So India, in some sense, is a dual economy. Let me conclude by talking about what are some of the needed policy responses ahead. And I'll talk about fiscal policy, monetary policy, and structural reform. On fiscal policy, I think it's necessary to implement the budget capital spending program of the government, an increase of 30%. But you also have to increase investment in healthcare and education. If revenue were to be more than expected, it is the time not to do fiscal austerity, but to spend more, especially for those who are struggling and are left behind, the poor, the rural workers, migrants, and so on. This is not the time for fiscal austerity. However, over time, you have to reduce the deficit and achieve fiscal consolidation. How will you do that? I would say 3 options. 1, increase asset sales, privatization and monetization of public assets, in part through PPPs. 2nd, rationalize the tax base, direct and indirect, and the GST rate structure. 3, reduce the informality of the economy so that the informal activity can be taxed. On monetary policy, there is a dilemma right now because inflation is rising, and it's going to rise next year too. I would suggest that for now, the central bank should go slow with the policy normalization because you don't want to kill the economic recovery. However, by next year, some policy rate normalization is necessary to prevent an unanchoring of inflation expectation. Moreover, the cleanup of the banks has to continue so they are less risk averse and are more willing to lend to the private sector. Of course, in India is a debate on whether the rise in inflation is transitory, the way the RBI believes, or more persistent. And we'll see what's going to happen in the data. Final policies. The country needs to do more structural reforms in order to increase potential growth. Land reform. Unfortunately, recently there has been a proposal to repeal 3 farm laws that goes in the opposite direction of necessary. Labor market reform to reduce informality, implementing the new bankruptcy and insolvency regimes, do more infrastructure spending, especially towards the green transition that the country needs, given the excessive reliance on coal and excessive pollution. Invest in innovation and R&D, invest into education, human capital, and healthcare, more aggressive privatization and growth of the private sector, having an improvement of governance, of the institutional framework of the country, and of course, reduce, where necessary, corruption. You also need to liberalize your trade and investment regime that has not been liberalized, because trade and investment are a major source of economic growth. The service sector, exports, especially IT, are the comparative advantage of the economy, but the country also needs to diversify the export base towards manufacturing. Now the costs are rising in China. There may be an opportunity to grow labor-intensive manufacturing in India, and that's going to be one direction to go. So, in conclusion, good progress has been done. The overall range of economic policies are in the right direction. The country is already having a potential growth of 7%. In order to reduce poverty and inequality, it has to grow 8-9%. And you need the right macroeconomic policy, monetary and fiscal, and the right structural reform in order to increase potential growth to a higher level. And I'm quite optimistic that the country is on the right direction in terms of pursuit of the right economic policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Roubini. You actually focused on absolutely the sentiment in the hall when you said that most unfortunately some structured reforms which had been planned have not been followed through, and in every country you have to balance policy, economics, and politics, and unfortunately the farm laws have fallen prey to that. Have fallen prey to that. So let me start with your first point which you raised. But I do find that in a prescriptive manner, what you have said is essentially that we are on the right path. We need to figure out the emphasis on different sectors. We need to diversify our base. We need to increase the employability and not just be focused on one area of the economy to see us through. You said that the global recovery will be anemic. You'd said recently that global economic recovery will be an anemic, what you just said, a U or a L-shaped recovery. Now, we've seen, Professor Roubini, that a year later we've seen IMF, which is more conservative than others, itself projecting 9.5% growth for India. Of course, bases change, but the fact is that we are positioned to be, on a relative scale, the fastest growing economy. So I'd like you, for our audience, please, to compare the India recovery and growth to the global recovery and growth, and what are the key preemptive or proactive steps that the government should be taking to accelerate our growth. You already referred to it, but if you can just compare and contrast global recovery with what you're saying on the Indian front. Is our story different in any way?
Well, on the global recovery, the IMF is overall optimistic that next year will be another year of above potential growth. I cannot rule out that that's going to be the case for the global economy, but I pointed out that there are a few things that can go wrong. We could have new variants of the vaccine, the virus, and some of them might be vaccine resistance. We're already seeing in Europe and in Northern Hemisphere, with the winter coming, a rise in new cases. The supply bottlenecks that we've seen all over the world seems to be more persistent than otherwise. Inflation seems to be rising more than central banks in advanced economy expected. That may force them to raise rates and exit unconventional policy faster than otherwise. And there is this slowdown of China that we don't know how bumpy it's going to be, and so on. So those are the downside risks. Of course, things can turn out better. Maybe the spread of the new virus is not going to be so severe. Maybe supply bottlenecks are going to go away. Maybe inflation is not going to be so severe. Maybe China is going to be able to do policy stimulus to maintain stronger growth. Maybe the supply bottlenecks are going to phase out. So, the world is uncertain. In this world, however, the recovery of India, I think, is going to be quite robust because India is a large economy that has trade and financial links with the rest of the world, but it doesn't depend as much on global trade as, for example, China does. And therefore, if there is going to be the sets of appropriate policies, maintenance of a fiscal stimulus, especially to those parts of the population who need it, the RBI not tightening too soon. Yeah, inflation is slightly above target, but it's not severely above target. And maybe inflation is going to fall. For example, there has been a good monsoon season that might lead to a fall in food prices. So this is not the time to tighten too fast and kill the recovery. So if the overall stance is of looser monetary policy, looser fiscal policy, even if inflation stays around 5%, I don't think there is a risk of a total de-anchoring. And if the government is still committed to do some of the structural reform, I think the animal spirit of the private sector will recover. There'll be a recovery of consumption, especially with the reopening of the economy. There'll be a recovery of capital spending by the private sector. There will be also a recovery of the housing market and of the property sector. And that can lead to the country growing even next year, 8% plus. So that will be all positive if that were to happen. And I think it's quite likely that the country is going in the right direction. You have to make sure, however, that some of the structural reforms are not reversed. And therefore, the path of the direction of structural reform is in the right direction of supply side opening up of the economy.
Yeah. I think with the deliberations we've had through the day, and we had several representatives, ministers of the government coming in, make it quite clear to me, Professor Roubini, that those structural reforms you are speaking about will only accelerate. Now, you wear the rather thorny crown, if I may say on a lighter vein, of being the Nostradamus of financial crisis. It must be a difficult, weight to bear when people expect you to make predictions. But what are your broad predictions? I just want to take you to your broad predictions about India and the world. Starting with the world, Professor Roubini, in your view, in your considered view, what is the biggest ongoing bubble? We just had in India a huge debate on cryptocurrency last week. I don't want to take you in that direction, but you've been saying that loose monetary and fiscal policies will continue to fuel asset and credit bubbles, propelling, in your words, a slow-motion train wreck. You said this. So what is the biggest ongoing bubble or the future train wreck, in your view?
Well, what I pointed out is that all over the world we have very, very low interest rates. We have zero policy rates in advanced economies, even negative policy rates. We've had quantitative easing, we've had credit easing. And only now, slowly, the Fed is going to do tapering of QE, and other countries are going to maybe start doing something similar. So we live in a world in which pretty much every asset price is expensive. You know, equity prices are expensive based on PE ratios or cyclically adjusted PE ratios, not just in the US, but also in other advanced economies, but even in India. In India, PE ratios are 2 standard deviations higher than normal based on the cyclically adjusted PE ratios. Real estate is expensive, and home prices and real estate has been booming all over the world as interest rates are low. Bond yields are still very, very low. You know, we have inflation in the US now at 5%, but 10-year Treasury yields are still only 1.5%, in part because, of course, the Fed has been buying long-term bonds and has artificially repressed the price and the yield. We have credit. Spreads are very low. There are many firms in the US are highly leveraged, and the leverage of these firms has gone even higher than before. And we have had these credit spreads low. We have all these meme stocks that are stocks of firms that pretty much don't have much profit or revenues. They've gone through the roof as people have been gambling. We had this bubble in crypto, where things that have essentially no fundamental value are going higher in prices. So I see an element of frothiness across many different asset classes, both in the United States and across the world. Is it a full-scale bubble? I don't know, but if we're going to have another 2 or 3 years of prices of anything from stocks to bonds to credit to meme stocks to housing to crypto going higher and higher, this asset and credit bubble eventually can go into a boom and then a bust and a crash. It's not a short-term prediction, but it's a prediction over the medium term, that there is excessive risk taking, excessive leverage, and excessive frothiness in a wide range of asset classes.
You called Bitcoin, if I'm not mistaken, a risky and volatile pseudo-asset with no intrinsic value. And yet there has been this ambiance of excitement, Professor Roubini, that's been created around it. And now in the next couple of weeks, we have a possible bill which could ban private crypto, what I call cryptocurrencies. I personally don't find them currencies at all in India. What is your view on the crypto craze?
Well, you know, my view is that calling these Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies currencies is a misnomer. Anybody who knows anything about monetary theory knows that for something to be a currency, first of all, it has to be a unit of account, but nothing is priced in Bitcoin. 2, it has to be a scalable means of payment. With Bitcoin, you can do only 6 transactions per second. With the Visa network, you can do 50,000 transactions per second. 3, it has to be a stable store of value relative to goods or services or wealth. It's so highly volatile that it's not a stable store of value. And 4, it has to be a single numeraire so that you can compare the relative price of different goods. But if you need a Pepsi token to buy a Pepsi-Cola and Coca token to buy Coca-Cola, you cannot even compare the relative price of goods and services. And if any asset were to be indexed into Bitcoin, it would be a disaster. Suppose you had a mortgage that was a unit of account in Bitcoin, and then the price of Bitcoin goes up, say, by 50%, then you go bankrupt because the real value in rupee or dollar of your Bitcoin, the mortgage, goes through the roof. So it has to be a stable store of value relative also to the price of financial assets. So in my view, calling them cryptocurrencies is a misnomer. They don't have any of the features of a currency.
Well, that's absolutely as blunt as can be. Thank you. A couple of more questions. Is it advantage India, or does it put India in a sticky spot My question is about what's happening between the US and China. Do you see the US and China, Professor Roubini, the gap widening? And what kind of direct or second order economic impact does this have for India? Do you see the gap widening, and how do we play this to our advantage from India?
Well, unfortunately, I hear that US and China are on a collision course towards a Cold War, and that Cold War is going to imply a decoupling over time between US and China in technology, in trade, in investment, in movement of labor, data, information, you name it. And because there is this rivalry, and the two countries are essentially rivals of who's going to be the dominant power in the world, and who's going to be also the dominant power in the technologies of the future. I think that US and India have a lot to cooperate. They can become formal allies. They're both a democratic nation. They have the same values, political values. They have the same economic system as a mixed market-oriented economy. They see China as a rival. China has also some territorial disputes with India. And the US is now building the Quad. There is this alliance is going to include Japan, Australia, India, and the US as a way of trying to contain the rise of China. So there is a lot, that in terms of technology, US and India can collaborate together and have synergies of investments and so on. So I think that, US believes in India and in the future of India, and I think that economic, political, and also geopolitical collaborations and financial one between India and US can become stronger over time to the mutual benefit of both countries.
Last question. Professor Roubini, you've been so kind with your time. If I were to say the future is 10 years away, this is 2021, we talk about 9 to 10 years away, which is considered more than a generation in today's times. What are the trends that are shaping up, which will determine the future? What is going to be the big bet? And where do you see India, our global position, in socioeconomic, demographic, and other terms?
Well, I would say that the future, of course, is in technology, because the COVID crisis has shown that, as I pointed out, the way we're going to live, work, study, shop, entertain is going to be based on hyper-digitalization. That's the future. And the great advantage of India is that India is already having comparative advantage in information technology services. It can diversify its economy also in other directions, but that's one of the advantages it has. And therefore, I see in India that with the appropriate type of structural reform, it grows 8 and 9% as opposed to 7%. And it becomes even more so having a comparative advantage in some of the industries of the future that are related to information technology in the broader range of them. In their applications from every aspect of society, including actually applications to financial services. The fintech revolution implies that payment services, credit allocation, asset management, insurance, capital market activity, all of those things are going to be developed via fintech. And in India has the technologies to be successful also in the fintech sector, among others. So that's your comparative advantage. And that's where you should be going.
And before I let you go, I want to remind the audience today, and you remember, Professor Roubini, May 2018, you retweeted Amitabh Kant, one of India's leading dynamic bureaucrats, about the transformation of digital payments in India. And you had said that you remember you said that? You said this is the true fintech revolution in digital payment systems. with billions of users and transactions happening. That's the fastest growing sector. And I think you were spot on, and that was 3 years back, 3.5 years back.
Yeah.
You know,
absolutely.
So what you've said about India, every word will be measured. I think you're extremely positive, and I think we're all geared up next time to welcome you physically. And next time we have our India Economic Summit. Professor Roubini, thank you, and a big round of applause from everyone here, please. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Always a pleasure to come and visit India. Thanks.
Pleasure. You're most welcome. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks.